Hello students, welcome back to our course on visual semiotics for visual communication. We will take today's lecture from where we have ended in our last class, that is with visual representation and abstraction. So, these are two major ways, categories of image that we see in our real world, and these are two categorization that we have. And based on that, we discussed in a great detail on how representation of images are done, and we just discussed a little bit about the abstraction. So, we will start from there, because today's lecture, as you can see, today's lecture we will be talking about visual narrative, and visual narrative is very relevant to this representationalism and abstraction. So, we have to understand this in a little bit more detail, and then we will look at what narrative is and how it works. So, if we go by our last discussion, we saw that image could be broken down into two distinct categories. One is representational and one is abstract. So, there is not much confusion in what representational image is. We looked at this particular image where Monet is very well depicting the sky and reflection of the sky on a pond. So, that is the title which he has provided, and that's what he is trying to depict, that's what he is trying to represent in this particular image, and we really do not have much difficulty in understanding that. Because if we go by that semiotic model again, we have a very good knowledge about the object which is being depicted over here. The representation of that object has been very prudently done, has been very realistically transformed. So, that is the signifier. So, this is the signifier of that particular place or object, and then this is having an expression. So, there is an expression of that through colors. These are nothing but blob of colors. We will just see in the next slide that these are nothing but some composition of colors and shapes coming together, and that at the end of the day reaches to the interpretant, which is you in this case, and you are processing that information and making a judgment with that real object, and hence the whole meaning of this representation comes into being. It is a very simple painting, but it holds a lot of elements, a lot of discourse about semantics and semiotics, because this is how we are making meaning out of it. But now let us, what is interesting is, let us take a deeper look and go closer. So, if we go closer in that particular painting, if we deep dive, you see that, as I was discussing, this is nothing but some color swatches, some kind of pattern which have come together. So, in other words, what we can say is that this is a level of abstraction. So, at a deeper, at a closer level, this is abstract. It is not representing anything for that matter which we can relate to the real world. But when we are taking a zoom out look, when we are taking an overall look, which we learnt in Gestalts also, that we make a judgment by the whole and not by the parts. So, when we take that overall holistic look, we can make out what this image is all about. But if we zoom in, we can see that there are certain color blobs, and this is exactly what is related to abstraction. The level of abstraction can lead to something which is representational, but at the end of the day we also deal with abstraction. So, it is at one go you might feel that everything is representational, and everything which is abstract is also part of representational, but there are certain aspects which are abstract and which also exists along with representational structures. So, we will see that in a little bit more details today. So, now going back to what the abstract means is art that represents nothing in physical world is abstract, and abstraction aims to take subjects from reality, but present them in a different way from the way are viewed in our reality. So, this is something which is very crucial when it comes to understanding what abstract is. So, one thing about abstract is that it is nothing to do with reality, or in other words, it is not trying to represent reality which we see the way they are. So, it is trying to again represent, no doubt that it is not trying to represent, that it is trying to represent. That is why we are getting the semiotic landscape. That is why the question of trying to infer that or interpret that comes into picture. Definitely we are in that position where we are trying to infer that, but what is important over here is that it is trying to represent the reality in a different way. The way you are seeing me, the way I will be represented, say someone is making a sketch of me or someone is making a painting of me, will try to represent me still and make people identify that, express that which is easily captured or easily perceived by the interpretant. But if now my same me is being represented in a different way, much different from the way you are looking at me, that will lead to an abstraction, and that abstraction may have some connection with reality or may not have some connection with reality. So, this is a very crucial stage where lot of imagination comes into picture, a lot of intellectual capacity comes into picture, variations in image comes into picture, and we see that many visual artists or visual designers or visual communicators use this sense of abstraction and representationalism in a very, very dynamic fashion to communicate with its receiver or viewer. So, moving on, we will look into some of the movements, art movements which took place related to abstraction, and look at some of the very, very crucial aspects of abstraction which evolved as a course of time as art movement. So, we first come into the genre of minimalism, where we see eliminating all non-essential forms or features or concepts. This is a very famous artwork by Kazimierz Malevich, which was done way back in 1915. So, you can see that this is nothing but a black square, and he has experimented a lot with this kind of forms which apparently does not mean anything, which is just a square, which is just a form, and he is trying to represent that as an artwork. So, this is a very important step in our discourse of visuality. So, as we said that we are part of a culture, and our way of seeing is deeply rooted to what we see and what has been shown to us. So, this we will discuss in much greater detail in our next lecture when we talk about visual culture and visual persuasion, for that matter, how it affects us behaviorally and things like that. But for this particular lecture, we are concentrating on some of the art movements, and these art movements, or you can say some of the trends in art, and these trends in art has been visible to us. The world has looked at it, made some inferences, and that has an impact, that has been rooted with us, and hence we have changed our way of looking at the world. So, this is keeping on, this keeps on happening with us. We change with technology, time, with different perspectives, viewpoints, and that changes our way we look at world. So, Malevich was a very, very crucial milestone in terms of what we see. Before this stage, there were representational expressionism, where you have something being represented in its true form, and we have talked about realism and impressionism in our last lecture, where we see that lot of stress was given on how accurate that is or how realistic the particular image looks like. But here you see nothing of that sort has been kept in mind. Rather, what has been kept in mind, what has been the crucial essence of this kind of artwork was elimination. So here the essence was on elimination, and it was not incorporation. So in expressionism, you see that there has been lot of incorporation of different attributes which make them look realistic. But when you are talking about abstraction and when you are talking precisely about minimalism, that is the minimum that could be done to represent something. So that is something which a modern world heavily banks on, is minimalism, and minimalism leads to simplicity. And these two concepts of minimalism and simplicity, which are notions of modernism, relies on elimination of forms, features and concepts. So here you can see that why in an artwork now we try to depict something. So we have, if we again go back to semiotic landscape, we have an object and we are trying to signify that, right? We are trying to signify that by incorporation of many things from that object. So this sign in that case could be iconic or indexical or symbolic to some extent, and we are trying to represent that in some fashion, and that being expressed in some other form which reaches to the interpretant. But here now you can see that a complete different approach has been taken, and this is not only crucial for us to understand and to study this as a subject, but also you can, all of you who are taking part in this course, you can rely on the fact that the communicators, the visual communicators, hold a very, very strong perspective or hold a very, very strong convention by which you can change the way the world looks at reality, or in other words, you can change people's attitude, people's behavior, people's way of seeing things, and that is held somewhere deep within you. You have the potential to do that, but to do that we have to first understand how other great leaders, other great practitioners have done that in past, and hence take a step forward. This is inevitable, because with the change of society, with change of time, the perspectives will change, the visuality will change, it will keep on changing. There will be new notions of abstraction, new notions of representationalism, who knows. But it is about the way you are trying to depict, signify, express, and all of it comes together and forms a different discourse. So here we are seeing that minimalism, which banks onto concepts of eliminating unnecessary forms, unnecessary concepts, and yet still perhaps trying to communicate something. So if we look at the next artwork, which is the 7 rectangles or 7 forms, so you see that it is nothing but he has used certain forms together, and that is perhaps creating some kind of connotation. So denotation wise, these are 7 rectangles, no doubt. So see, this is connecting with our last study of connotation and denotation. So visuality wise, these are just 7 rectangles placed in some kind of order, in some kind of directionality. But looking at it, if you again have a look at it, it may evoke some kind of connotation with you. You may evoke, it may relate to some kind of emotional attachment with you, and this may try, though it is abstract, but it may represent something in your mind, right? So that is the beauty of abstractionism. Perhaps Malevi was trying to represent something over here, but from a much different way that we see it in reality. It's not the way that you are seeing a tree, you are seeing a lotus pond, or you are seeing some person or something like that, but perhaps Malevi was trying to represent that with these 7 rectangles, but represented in a much different way that we see in reality. So this is what abstractionism in a nutshell is. Very interesting thing to understand, but very difficult to express. How do you bring the essence of something which is there in reality? You have taken the inspiration from reality, but you are depicting that in a way which is very different, and yet you are communicating with your viewers. So very important aspect to look at. Now we look at another aspect, which is all of you must have heard of Pablo Picasso and the movement which started in 20th century as a cubism with the avant-garde art movement, where a lot of changes were happening with conventional techniques. So a lot of difference was happening when we talk about cubism. So this was a non-conventional form. So the way we used to look at artwork, we take a deviation from that, we take a non-conventional approach. And here, if you look at this famous painting by Pablo Picasso, as early as in 1910, a girl with a mandolin. So this is a girl playing a mandolin, and if you see that there has been a lot of breaking and analyzing and resembling, putting it back into pieces. So there is a sense of analytical approach within an artwork, so which was previously just representational. Now we take a different standpoint and we try to analyze that, we try to break it. What does a scientific analysis does to a phenomena? It breaks it, it looks into the different aspects, investigates, and then puts it back and formulates something. So that is the way we take an analytical approach, and that same concept was coming in a very sublime fashion within art, where you are looking at any subject with a very analytical approach. You are breaking it down and then putting it back, and while you are doing that, if you see, a sense of multiple viewpoint comes into picture, a sense of time and space comes into picture, that you are looking at me from this angle, that would be very different if you go at the side and look at me. So you are looking at the same me, you are looking at your subject, the same subject, but something has changed. The time has changed, the space has changed. But in an artist notion, if you try to put them back together, because all that you have is one frame, all that you have is one visual media, where you are trying to communicate this fact that your subject could be viewed from different viewpoints. There could be a lot of analytical approach that I have put into, and you have just one slide to represent that. And that brought the concept of cubism, where you can study that in detail. There are very magnificent books about Picasso and cubism both. So cubism has a lot of many other participants in it. So where there is a notion of time, space, movement, and there's a notion of depth in the sense that it's not just one subject that you are seeing, but there you can see the same subject with different aspects, with different stories revolved around it, which is our theme today. That's why I started with abstractionism when we talked about visual narrative. And here you see the notion of abstract concepts are coming in, where it is showcased from reality in a very different way. So if you look at this work again, this is not the way you look at a girl with a mandolin. This is not the colors, these are not the forms that you see, but that has been the way which has been represented, and that is one step towards abstraction, which is very different, showcased in a very different from that of reality. And also there is a notion of cubism brought in with the fact of multidisciplinarity. Today we live in a world where we talk about multidisciplinarity when we talk about academic paradigms, but the notion of multidisciplinarity with performing arts, architecture, science all blending with each other and forming into the visuality was taking shape here. So this was the starting point with the beginning of 20th century, when we were taking a different look at art. We were taking a complete shift from the way of representationalism, and newer forms were taking shape, which we have clubbed together and calling it as abstraction. So let's look at the next one, which is another milestone in abstract concept, where we talk about futurism and precisionism. So futurism in a way was very rooted to technology. It was related to speed, time, scientific developments and things like that. So it is related with the time when it was being visualized, evolved. So it had it with the notion of science and technology and speed, youthfulness and things like that. So if we look at this artwork by Bocchini, which is talking about elasticity, so you see lot of elements, which is again a true form of abstraction you can see, but you can see certain objects or the influence of lines and figures, which are giving you a notion of industrialism, vehicles, technology, youthfulness, lot of commotion, violence, activity, clashes. So all of this together was shaping the futurism and precisionism. So where you get the a sense of that time where you are residing in. So it brings in the placelessness, the attribute of place where it belongs into the artwork. And if we look at the next work by Demuth, I see the figure 5 in gold. So you can see the textural quality. This is an artwork where it is taking an abstract thing which is 5 and bringing it into showcasing that and trying to communicate, and the title is I am seeing 5 in gold. And look at the kind of effect the particular image has, which has with it the luster, the youthfulness, the richness, the time and space and all of it together. But if you see the subject, which is very abstract in nature, which is just a number 5, but represented in such a fashion, it is something, an abstract concept, but represented in such a fashion that it brings with it certain kind of essence. So that brings us to the crux of abstraction, and that from there we will now take a leap into how a narrative is built. So I have shown you some kind of images which apparently doesn't denote anything, which apparently is a shift from reality, but all of them has a story to tell. It has something which engages you, and this is what is visual narrative. So if we look at by definition, what is a narrative? A narrative is a spoken or written account of connected events, or simplistically speaking, it's a story. So when we have connected events, there is a causal relationship of one event adding on to another, then adding on to another, a story gets formed. So basically it's a storytelling approach, it's a step by step approach. If we see now what are the aspects or what are the crucial features. So there's a causality, there's a time based approach, there's a interconnectedness, and there's participation of actors. So we have already talked about causality, and now we see there's a sense of time. So whenever we are talking about a story, whenever we are talking about a stream of events, there comes an essence of time. So that is something, another very important aspect which we saw, that some of the art movements were already addressing the notion of time in an image, in a static representation, and that is where we are stepping into the narrative concept, and then we move on to something which is interconnectedness. So, if I have an event here and an event here which are not connected, they do not take us to anywhere. So, there has to be an interconnectivity of events, and of course, there are now participants. So, in our last lecture, we last lecture where we talked about participants, the participants within your work and the participant as you and your viewer. So, all of them are playing a role here. So, the actors are part of this entire band of storytelling where the events are talked step by step. So, now if we look at visual narrative, so what an art or an image does, it essentially could be bifurcated into two notions. One is a narrative and another is a decorative. So, a narrative form is an event or story based approach, whereas a decorative form does not have any story based approach, it is a mere ornamentation. So, both are prevalent in our practice, both are prevalent in our visual communication, where we have a narrative approach, where we have sequence of events being unfolded within one visual field, and there is a decorative aspect. We still acknowledge and appreciate the decorative aspect of art and imagery, where a lot of decorations which does not talk about anything, it is just a visual representation of something which elaborates or expands certain things, that is all, but there is no aspect of narrative concept. So, that basically forms the visual narrative. So, narrative here, if we look at, essentially is dependent on some kind of representationalism, and decorative could be representation or abstract. So, there could be flowers and leaves being used for decoration, or it could be some abstract shape. But if you look at narrative, it has to be representational in notion, and we looked at something that even abstract forms are representational of the world, but depicted in a different way. So, even if in certain later segments we will see that maybe it is related to abstraction, but it has a connectivity with the representationalism. So, now we look at some of the features of narrative representation. Narrative patterns serve to unfold actions and events, which I have already talked. It represents a process of change, and it has a transitory spatial arrangement. We will come to vectors in a little while, but let us look at these three things together. So, here we know that it is talking about some kind of event in progression, and hence there is a process of change. So, your visual depiction is not static. Your eyes will move in your visual depiction, your meaning making will move in your visual depiction, and that has to follow an order. So, this order has to be efficiently represented on your image. So, in future whenever you are forming an image, an artwork, keep always in mind, if it is a narrative representation, this flow, this transitory spatial arrangement should be such that it takes you from here to there and there to there, and not the other way around, then the storytelling will be wrong, right. So, this is something that you have to keep in mind, and there comes the importance of vectors. So, there is a presence of a vector or a sense of a vector. So, vector is nothing but if I put an arrow, right. So, this is causing this, and then this is causing this. So, this is a very diagrammatic representation of how we many a times form our narration, but not always you put an arrow and represent something. There is a sense of a vector also in an artwork, and say for example, again we go back to Malevich, and it is just a red square and a black square. So, you see that this is an abstract representation, this is an abstract depiction of an artwork, but yet it is representing a diversion, of movement, there is a sense of escapism from the black which is dominant and the red which is vibrant and smaller. There is a sense of movement, there is a sense of escapism. So, you can bring in lot of representational attribute to it, but the idea here is, if we look back, there is a sense of vector coming into picture, and hence it will definitely evoke a sense of storytelling. Let us look at the other picture where beat the whites with the red wedge. If I would not have shown you this particular text and just shown you the image, you would have had a different notion, you would have a different connotation, and with the text it is making more sense. It is nothing but a combination of certain forms, but if you see over here, it is trying to tell you a story. There is something more than just some forms coming together. It is trying to tell you a story step by step. There is a sense of vector there. So, now if we look at vectors, bring with it the directionality, of course, and there could be amplified vectors, so which brings in the density, the intensity, the thrust of something which could be brought in by an amplified vector indicating density. There could be another aspect, if we look here, amplified vector indicating frequency. So, there could be vectors which are in numbers and trying to represent frequency. So, one could represent directionality, of course, one could represent the thrust, the force, the density, the other could represent the directionality, the frequency of all of it coming together, and then you have many a times attenuated vectors which are very indirect, which are not direct, which are not showing you the effect on your actors, but which are very sublime, somewhere there, very attenuated in nature. So, these are various kind of vectors that you can create in your artwork. So, in future when you are depicting your visual field, always keep these vectors of or sense of vectors in mind, and hence start your representational attributes, so that these vectors always work in place, and see whether you want an amplified vector over here representing density, you want certain different frequency to represent, or you want some attenuated vector. So, always have this in mind in your scheme of work, and then go ahead with your representation. So, now we look at another aspect of narrative representation, where we use the visual and verbal together. Not always we use the image, but we also use the verbal, and these are used interchangeably. So, they take their places, one represents another and another represents each other, I mean. So, they are used interchangeably, they are supporting each other. So, this many a times helps in our visual narrative formation. So, they are active participants in the image, and then coherent semantic structure of word and image is always visual. So, this is something very crucial for you to understand, that if the semantic logic, the meaning making attribute of the word and image are similar. So, if you are showing a bird and you are representing a bird, and if they are similar, then the concept, there is a coherent semantic attribute mapping them together, and the effect is always visual. So, what it means is, this bird as a word and this bird as a visual will together ultimately in your mind create an image, still create an image. Bird if I say, or apple if I say, at the end of the day it is creating a visual imagery in your mind, and hence you are recognizing what it means. So, they together are part of an image. So, we will have one of the lectures precisely dedicated to text and image, how do they interact with each other, but for the time being, for visual narrative purpose, understand that text and image go side by side and they always work in continuation. And then simultaneous and sequential bidirectionality of the participants. So, this is a case where, so we talked about participants, if you remember, within the artwork and outside the artwork. So, there could be a simultaneous bidirectionality. There is a communication happening between you and me through a artwork, and the particular artwork enforces that the what I wanted to create is seeking some kind of reaction from you, and there is a simultaneous bidirectionality with all the participants, or there could be a sequential bidirectionality that I convey something and you respond something. Say for example, if you look at a map, okay. So if you look at a map, for say this is a map and you have legends. So many a times we use legend over here, and it's over here and over here, and we have a small legend which terms what is what. So this is something, this is something, this is A, this is B. So see here the communication is happening in a way, this is a sequential one. So you look at this and then you look over here what he is trying to communicate. So I have tried to communicate step 1 is green is represented by A, and where, so you look back at the image and try to, so this is a sequential way in which the participants act, the image itself, me and you coming together and having a sequential narrative approach. So this is also part of a narrative which is talking about something in an event time spaced manner. So that in short brings us to this final classification where we have been talking about the representational structures. So representational structure could be broken into two forms. One is the narrative framework, which we talked in depth, and another framework which is a conceptual framework, which is, you can say, a time agnostic, which is time tested and which has been there, universal. Okay, so which is there over time, universal in nature, and that is something more conceptual, predominant in nature, owing to its classification factor, owing to the analytical factors by which we look at it, and owing to its symbolic factor. So mind that this has developed over course of time, this three aspects of conceptual representationalism. Say for example, you are representing a bird the way it is. Here what is happening, there is a class that you are trying to create, that it is a bird. So there is a classification which we have conceptually in our world. You remember the conceptual model and the mental model. So there is a map between them. So we classification wise we have certain things in mind, and we know that this is a bird, and then we have our analytical approach of what this bird is about, and then we have the symbolic nature what this bird is associated with, and that creates the conceptual representationalism. Whereas in a narrative representationalism we have something related to time and event based. So I will just show you one example which will clarify that. So when we show a dove here, you can see conceptually classification, analysis, and symbolic wise you have thought of something as soon as I put the bird there. But whereas in a narrative formation I have put a bird and another object together, and immediately it is starting to tell you a sequence of event over a time. So this is in short what visual narrative and visual representationalism and abstraction together brings us. So that ends our lecture over here. In our next lecture we will talk about visual culture. Thank you very much.